Okay. Good morning, everyone. Tanse, Anin, Buju, and bienvenue to everyone who is here. Welcome to what promises to be a very timely discussion on future-proofing diversity, equity, and inclusion. To say that the last few weeks have been a time of political instability is frankly a bit of an understatement. And I know that those who work and live in these spaces have been deeply impacted by the dramatic changes taking place in the US, as well as the reverberations we're feeling here at home. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Shannon VanRaes, and I'm Future of Good's editorial fellow on diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism in the social impact world. And just before I introduce our panelists, I want to take some time to recognize that I'm coming to you from Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory, which is located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Inanuwak, Anshinaawak, Dakota Oyate, and Dene. It is also the national homeland of the Red River Métis. Future of Good's home office is a little further to the east, and we recognize it is built on unceded Anishinaabe Algonquin territory in what is now called Ottawa. We recognize this because we wish to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who are our hosts and our ongoing responsibility to acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past while moving forward in partnership in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. With that in mind, Future of Good is dedicated to holding space for Indigenous voices, knowledge, perspectives, and ways of being in our journalism, and has committed to continually improving how we fulfill these intentions. Now, I'm going to introduce you to our first panelist, Celina Caesar-Chavannes. Celina was a member of Parliament for Whitby from 2015 to 2019, serving as Parliamentary Secretary to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the Minister of International Development. She is a speaker, an advocate for mental health, equity, and social justice, as well as an author. Her 2021 book, Can You Hear Me Now?, was shortlisted for the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. Celina holds an executive MBA from the Rotman School of Management, an MBA in Healthcare Management, and a Bachelor of Science in Human Biology, and is currently completing a PhD in neuroscience. So welcome, Celina. Thank you for being here. I'd also like to welcome our second panelist, Dr. Hayden King. Hayden is Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation on Chimnissing in Huronia, Ontario. He is the Executive Director of the Yellowhead Institute at Toronto Metropolitan University and has taught at McMaster University and Carleton University, as well as the First Nations Technical Institute. Hayden has held senior fellowships at Massey College and the Conference Board of Canada and served in advisory roles to provincial, tribal, and Inuit government and organizations. His writing, analysis, and commentary on Indigenous politics and policy are published widely. So Hayden, many thanks for joining us today. Now, just before we jump into this, and I hope we don't have a technical difficulty, but I'm going to draw everyone's attention to a poll question that should be popping up on your screen, if not now, then in a few moments. It should be there. Hopefully it's working for everyone, and you can answer that as you see fit. And we're going to revisit the same question at the end of the session and see if anyone feels a little differently. I don't know. Time will tell. Okay, let's get started with the first question. And before we look to the future, I really want to examine the recent past here at home. And I'm going to ask you both. Actually, before I ask you both, I'm going to share the results. I don't know if people can see the results of that poll or not, but it looks like 96% said yes and 4% said no. None of you are unsure, so that's pretty interesting, pretty strong results. Alrighty, back to this first question here. Before we look at what's going on right now, we want to look at, sort of what's gone on the last few years here at home. So my question to both of you, and I'll elaborate a little bit, is has the Trudeau government lived up to its own hype? They promised to end boil water advisories, tackle anti-Black racism, and implement feminist foreign policy. They promised sunny ways, but in terms of dollars and progress, has this Liberal government really moved the needle as much as they'd like to think? Will history remember the Trudeau era as one that championed diversity, equity, and inclusion? And Celina, since you were once part of that government, I'm going to start with you on this question, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because I think people will remember some of the things that the Trudeau government has done. It was 2015. We have a gender balanced cabinet, the appointments of various governor generals that were the first. And that's all well and good, and that is all, important in terms of visual, because representation does matter. Um, but I think I'll shape this question from the perspective of, remember in 2015, we had a majority government, 180 something seats. We had a beachhead, so to speak. We had one side of the house, and then around the other side, a real majority government. And so the challenge here is thinking about what we did with that majority. And we still have 20 something boiled water advisories. Um, we could have put the best and the brightest, worked with Indigenous communities, really tackled this issue, not from a paternalistic perspective, but from one that engaged and really centered a real serious issue. And I don't want to use the analogy of if this was happening in Toronto or if this was happening anywhere else. It's happening in a G7 country. And we can and should have done better. We look at anti-Black racism initiatives. Of course, everybody will point to, the Black Entrepreneurship Fund, and other initiatives that the government has put in place. But they're also fighting federal public servants with a Black class action multi-billion dollar lawsuit, one in which the government's reports continuously show anti-Black racism within the federal system. These are individuals, mainly women, who have faced long-term anti-Black racism, or Black women that have faced long-term anti-Black racism within the federal system, that report after report after report has showed nothing has been done, and the racism continues, and the government legitimately holds the pen on this. We know how expensive things are to go through a court system. The government holds the pen on ensuring that this class action lawsuit is settled, and they're dragging their feet on it as well. Have they lived up to the hype? The devil is in the details on this one. And while they may put up some nice window dressing and say, here, let me point to this, let me point to that, let me point to the other, when you look deeper into the issues and you see that there are really some systemic problems that have not been uncovered, you really got to ask yourself, did they actually tie their promises to a real accountability metrics? And this word accountability seems to be forgotten in how we deal with our governments. Um, Shifting the funding power to affected communities, like really engaging in a real and authentic way, and move away from this performative, it's because it's 2015, to actual systemic reform, and have that real change that Sunny Ways should have produced actually not just be a rhetorical punchline, but an actual on the ground fact.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot to dig into there. And a complicated question, a complicated yeah, set of factors. Hayden, I'm curious to get your take on this.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways I would agree. And, I think back to 2015 and the excitement and enthusiasm for, the Trudeau era and the first Trudeau government that's, was referencing that great majority. And there's nothing wrong with being ambitious. Everybody wants to see a government, commit to transforming a country that was really, I think partially dismantled by 10 years of the Harper Conservatives. And so there was a lot of support for Trudeau and the Liberals, I think, in many corners of the country. I mean, even Indigenous leaders who are historically, traditionally, perpetually skeptical and cautious of Canadian governments, were lining up for selfies, and Trudeau got a headrest. And so I think it's really difficult to sort of assess whether or not the government has moved the needle so soon after, and we're not even there yet, but after 9 years of Trudeau in power. But the context matters, and And I think it's a classic case of overcommitting and underperforming, in many of the areas that Trudeau set out to achieve. We did see this slide towards that performative and superficial approach that Celina mentioned. And I think that was true for Indigenous issues for sure. It was the quote most important relationship, the nation to nation relationship. We're gonna support Indigenous people if they say no to development. We're gonna implement the 94 calls to action. A lot of commitments that were received really well, and then as time went on, we started to see how those commitments really didn't materialize. I think the 94 calls to action is a really great example. Trudeau had 9 years to implement these 94 calls to action, and only by 2 independent analysis, 13 have been completed. And some of these are really easy, right? Like the calls to action asked that the government collect data. Let's collect data on how Native people are doing in the child welfare system, in the education system, in the healthcare system. And that hadn't been done. It hasn't been done for 9 years. It's like the low-hanging fruit of reconciliation. And why not do it? Like, what is the hesitation there? And for me, I think the hesitation is the fear of being perceived, the fear of being actually seen as, performing reconciliation, performing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And once the data comes in and you realize it's not actually happening, then the sort of curtain is drawn back. And so I think that there's many metrics that we could use to rate the effectiveness or success of the Trudeau governments in terms of moving the needle. And I think on most counts, you would say that it hasn't moved. I think one thing I will give Trudeau credit for was opening the space for these discussions. Because before Trudeau came into power, we weren't talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the ways that we are today. We weren't talking about reconciliation in the ways that we are today. So by opening up the space for dialogue, Trudeau inadvertently, I think, offered an opportunity for Indigenous people, for racialized communities, for women, for queer and trans folks to actually push their agenda and move the needle themselves. And so the terrain, the landscape did change. But as much credit is owed, more credit is owed to those folks to push the needle than I think is owed to Trudeau or Liberal government over the last 9 years.
Yeah, that's an interesting point about the metrics. I know as a journalist, we're often looking for those numbers and don't find them because they don't exist, which is a perpetual problem. Of course, that problem may grow in the coming years. So I want to pivot a little bit to the current situation and maybe where we're heading. We definitely don't have time to run through every step US President Donald Trump has taken to eviscerate diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility over the last 24 days here. I think we'd be here all week. But I think it's fair to say 2 things. The impact of Trump's statements and executive orders represents a real tidal shift in policy and direction. And 2, the anti-DEI backlash we're seeing in America has, clearly been building for some time. So my question to each of you is, with that in mind, is the DEI backlash also growing in Canada? And if so, how much and how quickly? Do you see this country following the US down this road? We have heard some very similar rhetoric, coming from Canadian politicians, particularly Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, particularly around trans rights. Is this country turning right at the next set of lights? Hayden, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, it's a scary time, definitely a scary time for friends and family in the United States, and the language and the discourse that's being deployed there. I think that you have seen in Canada over the past, I would say, I mean, for a very long time, but I think in the last 5 or 6 years, I've seen you've seen it ramp up with the rise of some of these far right and conservative movements, and those sort of public movements are influencing policy, to be sure. I think what's interesting about the rise of conservatism in the last few years is how many of the communities that Justin Trudeau aimed to appeal to felt betrayed and have started to actually turn towards conservative values. I think what Donald Trump has done, and this might sound counterintuitive, is actually attract large numbers of racialized voters in the United States. Like, even though there is this, xenophobic and even racist rhetoric, somehow conservatives have been able to create a big tent movement in the United States. And I think in Canada, the same is true. I think we have a lot of communities, and I think First Nation communities are not an exception to this rule, that feel betrayed over the past 10 years and are starting to see the appeal of conservative values and conservative politics. I don't know how the recent polling affects that, but yeah, I think that that's a surprising outcome of the discourse that we've seen in the last 5 years. And I think about that famous photo of people being deported in the United States wearing T-shirts like Latinos for Trump, right? People voting against their own interests, and I think that is true to the same extent in Canada, but it's that sense of betrayal that are driving people there. And as they're being driven to these conservative values, they're also adopting these notions of diversity, equity, inclusion as being not merit-based, and being hostile to their ability to get ahead and live a good life. And so there is a cognitive dissonance that I think is occurring both in the United States and in Canada. And the promise of DEI is that diversity is going to strengthen our workplaces, is going to strengthen our organizations, is going to strengthen our governments. And having practiced it for the past 9 years plus, we should see the results of that. And so any wise government, that is any wise federal government, should be able to see that this is actually good for everybody, and not be overtaken by the discourse that's rooted, really, as I said, in that cognitive dissonance. So that's not answering your question in a straightforward way, but I think that in Canada we can definitely prepare for this backlash and this swing towards conservative values as well.
Thanks for that. Yes, Celina, same question to you.
Yeah, so I mean, I think even the idea that Canada is swinging towards something and that we're not already there, albeit in a polite way, is crazy to me. I can't think of, and I'm not just talking about, DEI writ large. I'm talking about systemic racism and the harm. Let me just drop a few names in case people forget. Defonte Miller, Colton Bushi, Joyce Echewan, Abdirahman Abdi. Like, the result of this like hate has been living, breathing, and working here for a very long time. And so to frame it in the context of DEI doesn't make any sense to me. And to think that there is a growing movement afoot within the Canadian populace because of the United States, again, I'm going to use the word accountability again. It removes the accountability that we have for how we operate as a nation away from our own responsibilities. And that is very, I think it's very dangerous in that context to say, well, look at the US, they're so bad. That is the lowest bar that we could possibly step over. You don't even have to jump over that bar. Like, we are stepping over that bar. And so I think as a nation, we have an ability to say, let's do better. And I'm just going to go back a minute to 2018. And you have to remember in 2018, I was in Parliament. I called out Maxime Bernier at the time, the first time in a federal government, in a federal budget, that Black communities were named and money invested in Black communities in Canada. First time ever. And Maxime Bernier said, oh, I don't know why we need this. You know, I don't see color. We should be colorblind. And I tweeted, check your privilege and be quiet. The backlash that came, I was dragged for weeks by media, by my own colleagues, by people across the aisle, by friendlies, by liberals, by conservatives. It didn't matter. I was dragged. Canada had an opportunity at that point to show its mettle related to its difference from the United States. And that did not happen. So let's not pretend that this evidence of backlash coming from Trump has not existed here for a very long time. And I think for Canada, it's less of a wake-up call and more of an opportunity to say, how can we do better? Not better than the lowest bar, but how can we do better as a nation that the world needs more of? And so there is a huge juxtaposition between what Canada appears to be on the surface and then how we sort of operate. The Prime Minister taking a knee after George Floyd and then again not settling this Black class action lawsuit is nonsense. So there has to be a way to hold ourselves to account while not sort of positioning us as better than the lowest common denominator.
Some very interesting themes there that I hope we can circle back to as we go through some of what's on the agenda. But yeah, I think those are some excellent points. The US is not the yardstick or meter stick for us to measure ourselves by. Looking, I guess, then at where we are right now, and the upcoming potential of an election here in Canada in the spring. I'm curious to get both of your takes on what is the best way for nonprofits, be that charities, post-secondary institutions, to protect diversity and inclusion efforts. And I mean their programming, their funding structures in the face of government hostility. So I'm wondering, how is that facilitated? Does DEI need a rebranding? How can the core purposes of diversity, equity, and inclusion be protected, possibly by reframing? And Celina, I'm going to start with you on this one because you did make, I'm not going to quote it directly, but a really interesting social media post last week, which you yourself said would be unpopular, and paraphrase, I think, in your explanation, saying that anyone who worked in, quote, DEI wasn't doing DEI, so it's time for it to die. And I want you to dig into that for us in this context.
Yeah, absolutely. It is time for DEI to DIE. And I framed it from the perspective of, and I'll answer your question about what we do next in a minute. I framed it from this perspective of diversity is ubiquitous. We don't do diversity. We apply intersectional strategies or lenses to marketing strategies or to hiring practices that then result in diversification of an organization. But the strategic insight that we provide to organizations to improve their recruitment efforts or to improve their product offerings or services in the market is not D. We don't do D. It's a result of what we do. It's a result of a strategic reframing or an operational analysis that we do that allows for that to happen. Secondly, so when we think about that, if culture eats strategy for breakfast, then if the strategy is around diversifying and we as people of color or people with often intersecting identities, apply that strategic or operational lens, we are able then to apply it to changing the culture of organizations. So we do cultural transformation that allows for that psychological safety, which then produces inclusive environments. We don't do inclusion. We do cultural transformation within organizations. Again, that is related to strategy and operations. And the output is a safer organization where people can be included, can raise their hand, can share their stories, can share their experiences so that you're offering better products, services, policies, whatever. And those products, services, and policies or whatever are produced are then more equitable in their impact because they had that diversity and that inclusion that produced that equity. So yes, I think that DEI, just like the evolution of all the other words, we get tied to these words like we have to do DEI. No, we don't. We get tied to these words, and then we don't see how they evolve over time from civil rights to affirmative action to DEI. That it's going to evolve. The work that is done by people with often marginalized intersecting identities is so critical and integral to an organization's success. Stop using some random word that you pulled out of somewhere to articulate the complexity of what we add to organizations. So in terms of what organizations can do, what nonprofits, institutions, academia can do is really be intentional about integrating the strategies that produce D, E, and I into their core operations. So instead of DEI being a department, you could have someone that oversees it across your marketing, across your accounting, across your high HR, across your whatever, across the whole organization to make it not performative. And then again, I'm going to put this accountability measure in it. Tie that to your bonuses, tie it to your annual reviews. If this is important for you, make sure you tie it together. And then move beyond that representation to actual power shifts. Most people who have the ability to have DEI type of departments have power and they have privilege. And if you're not using that power and privilege to shift the conversation, to actually have the ability to put some skin in the game, to put some investments back into marginalized communities, to put investments back into organizations or to community groups that are doing some great work, then what are you really doing? And I think one of the challenges that we see in the US that we could possibly see here as well is when you don't codify or put things into law, they don't actually work. And so as you have to make sure that it's an imperative, it's a strategic imperative for organizations to be more intentional around how they operate, how they use that strategic insight and leverage that strategic insight to build that diversity. We shouldn't still be having, less than 10% of CEOs of Fortune 500s or board directors as non-diversified groups. That it's nonsense. It doesn't match the population. The demographics are off. And so there has to be a little bit more intentionality and integration of these strategies to produce those results.
I'm just going to dig into that before I move on to Hayden. I mean, you've touched on some things here. Can this intentionality exist without a dedicated label? If we, is this a rose by any other name? Will government, should there be a shift in policy, not, eliminate programs or funding if it's cleverly, rebranded in a way that maybe is less obvious to them?
So I find it interesting that we keep sticking on this DEI point and talking about it. We did this with climate. ESG, do you hear that a lot on the news? No, we're talking about sustainability. We have shifted. We have had a different conversation. We know the risk that climate brings. And so organizations that get it are not going to be bogged down by having the conversation of, should we still use ESG or not? You just change the words. Like, what it's going to cost your organization if you don't do it. And so instead of getting tied up talking about language, and it's going to cost you billions of dollars, then what is your priority? Discussing the language of ESG or shifting away from that and saying, look, we need to do this. And we're not going to use ESG. We're going to use sustainability. We're going to use, climate mitigation. We're going to use whatever language is necessary to shift the conversation so we could get our business done. And we could also understand internally and externally that this is still a priority for us. So the conversation around keeping DEI or a rose by another name, the scent of the rose is still going to be there. We're still going to see the rose. We're still going to get the beautiful byproduct of having the rose in our garden. We don't need to call it a rose.
Excellent. Thank you for that. That's yeah, really clear and expansive, so I appreciate it. And Hayden, I'm going to ask you the same question, but frame it in a slightly different way. Since 2021 and the discovery of unmarked graves and Kamloops, I mean, the Canadian public and civil society seem to have gained, a somewhat better understanding of Canadian colonialism and the need for both truth and reconciliation. And in some instances, this appears to have translated into government funding for programming or shifts in government policy that prioritize reconciliation or Indigenous-led programming. And I'm wondering, what risk does this political shift that we're experiencing pose to this in particular, and how Indigenous and also non-Indigenous organizations continue the work they're doing if they lose government support or if government becomes more hostile to this? How might an equity and inclusion backlash impact, this kind of work, and how can it be protected against?
Yeah, I guess I would sort of pick up the conversation that Celina started and talk about DEI more in its utility as a framework against the backdrop of its co-optation. So, like, this as a framework is, I think about what Evelyn Hugh Duhart, the great disability activist, said about fire insurance, right? So you have Indigenous people, racialized communities, queer, trans women asking for structural change to organizations and institutions and demanding that, and existing in a framework of contention, challenging these very institutions. So in response, what power does, what these institutions do, is offer some fire insurance so they don't burn the place down. And that fire insurance in some ways can take the can appear as reconciliation. It can appear as DEI. And in a lot of ways, it's an alibi, right, to allow those institutions of power out of their actual obligations to do anything meaningful, to do anything structural. And so in that way, the framework is used both by those with power as a way to co-opt the movement, to create tokenistic hires, to create committees, to study the issue, to offer discrete funding streams that still have very strict criteria that are still controlled by those with power. But it's also used by individuals that are demanding change as a tool, as a leverage to open up the gaps and the cracks in the structure and push forward their own change. As I was saying before, driving the needle themselves. So it's just this opportunity. And I think how we're talking about DEI as needing a rebranding is less so much about preserving the concept and the nature of DEI as it exists, but really pushing us back towards those conversations about structural change. So whatever comes after DEI, whatever comes after reconciliation or the next era of reconciliation, this moment in time that we've been agitating is going to push us towards that next moment in time. And so it's less for me on those organizations and those governments, those powerful institutions to make the changes themselves, but it's more for Indigenous people in particular to take those opportunities where they exist and kick the door open to what that new thing is. And every time we go through one of these cycles, every time we go through one of these rebranding, those opportunities get greater. Sometimes they constrain, right? And I think that that's what we're seeing in the United States. I think that's what we will see if we aren't already seeing it in the Canadian context. And so our strategies to combat it shift and change likewise, right? Like it's a constant co-constitutive interaction. And so the second part of your question was, yeah, I think that I answered it, right? I think that Maybe just to use an example from the philanthropic community, because I know that there are folks in that sector in this conversation. It's like the difference between, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, let's create a funding stream for Indigenous people to access that they can benefit under the guise of reconciliation from our resources to push forward whatever agenda they want, but the criteria, the reporting mechanisms, the application process, none of that is different, right? It's still the same. Power hasn't shifted. So that's like a classic approach to DEI. We're just going to call this DEI. We're going to include some Indigenous people. We're going to change nothing structural about our organization. On the other hand, you have examples of foundations that are saying, we're actually just going to transfer our wealth to Indigenous communities. So that's a structural shift, right? That's actually meaningful. That's actually tangible. That's an approach to diversity, equity, or inclusion, or however we're going to talk about it. That is concrete, and that shifts the structure, that changes the structural approach. And so if we're talking about sort of future-proofing DEI, or however we want to describe the framework, it's those structural changes. And those are going to be the meaningful ones that produce the outcomes of the things that Celina is talking about.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I feel like there's, and we'll get to this later, but there's some optimism, under some of your answers here, which is really encouraging for me. And I'm curious to see how the people who have logged on feel about that, as well as we move towards some of our final questions. I guess maybe before I move on to the next question, one thing I did want to get down to sort of specifically in terms of future proofing was sometimes when there is a move away from progressive ideas and progressive organizations, there is also a loss of funding. And in practical terms, some organizations may just not have the finances under a future government that they had under a past government. So I'm wondering if you also, and I know that this is I'm just kind of springing this on you, if there is a sense that other areas in philanthropy will make up for changes, or that there is a fluidity that will sort of protect against possible loss of government finances. And I don't know, either one of you can jump in on this one if there's someone who wants to start off.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we do what we can with what we have, and some of the most powerful movements for change have very little. And certainly we want to provide services and programs to communities that desperately need them. But I think, in a lot of ways, folks that are interested in this type of politics are not necessarily sort of hitching their wagon to the political stripe of whatever government is in power. It's my hope that foundations, the philanthropic community, NGOs would come in and support those communities, but it's unclear to me at the moment. I think we are definitely on the downslope of reconciliation. We're on the downslope of reconciliation in the public discourse, in the public square, in the political discourse. And I think that that's inevitably influencing conversations in the nonprofit sector and the foundation level as well. So we'll see. This is an indirect way of answering your question, but we'll see who's really committed to this type of politics.
The only thing I would add here is that so to Hayden's point, a shift in or reframing in how we think about the power that we hold and what we could do with that. So shifting, I think, from funding programs and not policy power, meaning you could fund service delivery, but not the advocacy that protects against that service delivery. That's a key part where you could change how you operate as a funder or as a philanthropic organization. Many of these organizations, when I was in Parliament, you would have, I'm not going to name them, but various interest groups lobbying with big suits and big briefcases and massive amount of people that you had to like get boardrooms for. And then you would have, you know, your nonprofits, your charitable organizations, the social services sector come in with, you know, 2 or 3 people and a child and a story. And oftentimes they got dismissed, or they'd come into my office and say, well, we didn't get, the meeting that we had was canceled, because they didn't have the funds or the strategy or the big GR firm behind them. And so fund policy and advocacy capacity, and fund it now before the election, not after, when, you know, when the charitable sector is getting the crumbs that everybody else has devoured from. And, you know, supporting organizations that just don't have capacity to speak up for themselves, that don't have, like, there is a way to think differently about how we strategize here. And, you know, the funding doesn't have to be in the traditional way that we've always funded, especially if we know that we need a different strategy or renaming of our current literature, so it's more business focused, having a consultant, you know, paying for a consultant to go in to help them, you know, pivot. There are different ways to do that. And I think we just think about programs and program delivery because that's what the organizations usually do. But we have to have a broader sort of scope of what funding those organizations so they could survive beyond a change in government, so they could future-proof their organization. And what does that look like? And how can this sector help bolster that, support that, and put them on firm ground so that in the next 4 years, we're not having the same conversation with them?
Thanks for expanding on that. That's great, and very useful. The next, I'm going to pivot a bit to sort of big picture here. And you know, while Canada shares the same political currents, the same ideologies as the U.S. in many ways, we don't have the same political structure. We don't have a two-party system. Our Senate is unelected. The PMO has different powers. But the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms is also enshrined in our Constitution. And I think, Celina, you touched on this very briefly about the need to have legislative protections. So I'm wondering if, you know, you see the Charter as a guardrail for, you know, progressive thought and social purpose entities in Canada. Can this protect, you know, programs or affirmative action? Or are we moving, you know, into an era of lawfare where this will need to be relied on? I guess that's sort of 2 questions and a bit vague, but maybe Celina, you're unmuted, so I'll start with you on this one.
So we don't want lawfare. To get to the court system, to get to the Supreme Court, it's like a dozen years and how many millions of dollars to do something that a political person can actually do with this little thing that costs, like, you know, maybe $3 at the store. So I wouldn't want us to get to the point where we're thinking about protecting whatever terminology we use through a court system that, and I understand what the Charter of Rights and Freedoms does, and it protects, it's a legal foundation, it provides a legal foundation for DEI, but its protections are not absolute and they can be overridden. We've seen that before by governments using notwithstanding clauses, or weakened by a political or judicial interpretation. Like, I would be very remiss to go down that road. And I'm wanting us to do a little bit better, to think a little bit differently about our power as people. Now, democracy comes from the Greek words demos and kratos, and that means the power of the people. And I'm sorry, this is really getting me emotional, because I think along the way, we as the people have maybe not forgotten our power, but have been sort of stamped down by the fact that we keep asking for these changes and they aren't happening. And I want to go back to Hayden's point for a moment, because he talked about, you know, the frameworks of DEI and, you know, how we have to get back to breaking down the structure. And in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, she talks about the fact that race is the skin, caste is the bones, race is the skin, right? And it reminds me of what Hayden was saying. I wrote it down because these frameworks, these things that we're using are just the skin. They bruise and they could break and we could like tear them open, but just like the skin, they'll just heal back. And so if we're not tackling that structural power that exists as people who have power, we're going to be having these conversations for a very long time. And in fact, we have been having these conversations for a very long time. And at this point, you know, you gotta requote Rihanna here, like, have your friends pull up. We can't be talking about these issues when a George Floyd is on the ground. We can't only have our allies pull up when we're at war. So stop saying that you're an ally and just be a friend. Like, be there in between, be there protesting and asking for change and demanding change in between. I don't need an ally. I don't need someone to show up. Oh my God, Trump is having this big war on DEI. And then all of a sudden, everybody wants to have a conversation. Where were you? Where were you when the rest of us were still working on the ground? Where were you? So, like, yes, we could talk about the charter, and yes, we could put it in other places. But until the biggest structural barrier to change gets actually disrupted, which is the way we think, talk about cognitive dissonance, the way we think, until that changes, we are not going anywhere. And that doesn't mean that we or Hayden, myself or Hayden, need to change and need to continue to do the work while y'all just sit back and what, come around every 4 years? Nah. And I mean, I love that Hayden's so optimistic. Maybe I'm the pessimist of the group, but I also want to be very realistic about the work that people do every day that seems to bubble up in every 4-year cycles, and it's just not fair. Y'all need to pull up. People on this call who have the capacity to fund organizations that are doing work, who know that they turn that 10 cents and they stretch it as far as possible to make good things happen on the ground. Pull up for them. Pull up in different ways. Pull up for us. And that's how you can make change happen, not in a charter that takes too long and we don't have that kind of money.
Thank you for your honesty and yeah, and your passion there. I really appreciate that answer. And I know we're getting short of time, so I'm going to go to Hayden next, and I'm going to ask for your take on that same question or anything else that you want to follow up on that we've talked about here today.
I don't think that there's anything to add to what Celina has just said, to be honest with you. You know, from an Indigenous perspective, it's the law is rarely on our side. I think that there's the discourse that that we are constantly winning these legal battles, but you know, and speaking about the optimism, I think that the times where I see bulkhead being established against the this attempt to expand colonialism in our territories, it's when communities are doing exactly the thing that Celina suggests that they are. You know, I think about we have all these processes, land claim processes. We can fight for our land through those processes, which are controlled entirely by the government of Canada, who says what is eligible for negotiation and what the restitution is going to be. So you have communities that have decided we're not going to participate in those processes. We're not going to spend 20 years in court and $20 million suing a province or the federal government. Instead, we are going to exercise our sovereignty on our own terms. And you see that happening on what are called Aboriginal title lands, where no treaties exist, and communities are just stepping into their jurisdiction and their sovereignty and doing it on their own terms. And forcing, I think, Canada and in some ways Canadians to ask themselves, oh, wait a second, what is the basis of our sovereignty? What is the basis of our jurisdiction? And sometimes those critical questions can lead to the type of changes in how we think that Celina is talking about. Mostly they don't. But I think I see in Indigenous politics or Indigenous issues more generally, communities doing the thing, right? They're not going into court. They're saying, this is what we want, and we're going to assert our rights and our sovereignty, and we're going to do it ourselves. And so that's one channel that we don't talk about. You know, as Canadians, it's this, you know, formality is an expectation that we must subscribe to particular processes and policies. And well, what happens when we don't? What happens when we sabotage those policies and processes? What happens when we manipulate them? Because why should we be above manipulation? Might be surprised by the results.
Oh, well, I feel like this conversation could go on for another hour, maybe two, but unfortunately, we don't have any more time. So I just want to finish by saying that another poll is going to pop up. So before we move on to closing, I hope that pops up, and just keep an eye out for that. There we go. So take a look at that, and we'll just give you the results before we head out here. And it looks like they're changing. I would say we have some different results. More people are unsure. We have some more no's in there than we had before. So, wow, I think this conversation really got people thinking and looking in different directions. And that's really all we can ask for at the end of the day. So definitely have got people thinking and changed some minds. So Hayden, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been wonderful. Celina, thank you very much for your time. And yeah, hopefully we will be able to do this again in the future. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you, Hayden. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.